History has long been told through the lens of conquest, kingship, and empires. Grand narratives dominated by the exploits of men in crowns and armor. Their names echo through time, etched into stone, sung in songs, and taught in schools. Yet, beneath these towering stories lies another truth, far less visible but no less powerful. The stories of women, especially queens, who ruled, reformed, resisted, and reimagined the world from behind veils of silence and shadows. These women did not always sit on thrones enshrined in gold, and their crowns were not always visible, but their influence shaped civilizations, redirected histories, and carved legacies that endured far beyond their lifetimes. Think of a queen whose name was never spoken in your textbooks, whose portrait never hung in galleries, yet whose choices prevented wars, fostered trade, and elevated entire cities. Imagine a woman who never led an army into battle, but whose strategic advice to generals decided the fate of kingdoms. Picture a mother who, while hidden in palace quarters, quietly influenced royal succession, negotiated with enemies, and maintained the fragile threads of an empire through cunning diplomacy. These are not the fantastical inventions of fiction. They are the stories of real women whose impact has been obscured by the biases of traditional historical narratives. For centuries, queens have been cast either as beautiful consorts or dangerous schemers, reduced to roles that strip them of political agency or visionary leadership. But what if we told you that many of them were neither ornaments nor villains, but nation-builders, visionaries, and quiet revolutionaries? In ancient Egypt, in the royal courts of China, in the temple states of Mesopotamia, in the sacred forests of pre-colonial Africa, and the stone temples of South America, women held power, not borrowed from their husbands, but wielded in their own right. They built cities, funded libraries, commanded respect, led religious movements, and in many cases, made decisions that changed the course of history. Their stories are not just worth telling. They are essential to understanding the full complexity of human civilization. To ignore them is not only to erase individuals, but to miss the deeper truth, that history was never just a chronicle of men. It was a shared story, one that includes the fierce intellect of a Hittite queen like Pudu-Hepa, the political savvy of Empress Lu of Han China, the unyielding will of a warrior like Boudica, and the spiritual authority of the god's wife of Ammonius in Thebes. These women didn't just support empires, they shaped them. And yet, history left many of them behind, buried under layers of myth, male-centered storytelling, and deliberate omission. But no more. Welcome to Words of Time, where we unravel the forgotten, the silenced, and the misrepresented stories of our past. In this video, we'll embark on a journey to rediscover the hidden queens of history, those whose power shaped civilizations not through brute force, but through wisdom, resilience, diplomacy, and quiet strength. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of time to reveal the women who changed the world, even when the world refused to remember them. Throughout history, the grand narratives have typically revolved around the actions, ambitions, and legacies of kings and emperors. These stories have often overshadowed the foundational roles that powerful queens and influential women played in shaping the course of civilizations. Though the royal men occupied the thrones and led armies into battle, it was often the women, queens, advisors, consorts, priestesses, and regents, who ensured political stability, orchestrated diplomatic alliances, and influenced spiritual beliefs across ancient societies. This quiet strength and strategic foresight formed the forgotten foundations of many empires. The stories of queens who acted from behind the curtains of power are as complex and compelling as those of the kings who were celebrated in stone and script. These women operated in societies that seldom allowed them formal rule, yet they forged avenues of power through intellect, religion, and interpersonal influence. They played vital roles in the political, cultural, and religious domains of their times. In the case of Pudu-Hepa, the Hittite queen, her contributions were central to the maintenance of the Hittite Empire. Living around the 13th century before the Common Era, she was not merely a consort, but an equal to her husband, King Hattusa III. Pudu-Hepa signed treaties in her own name, corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs, and actively shaped foreign and domestic policy. Her legacy has survived not through tales of conquest, but through clay tablets revealing her political acumen and religious devotion. Similarly, long before Wu Zetiya declared herself the only female emperor of China, there were women within the Tang court who exerted significant influence. Wu Zetian's rise was itself a product of strategic patience and acute understanding of court politics. But even she stood on the shoulders of other women, Consorts and concubines who advised emperors, steered cultural values, and maintained the continuity of dynastic power during times of uncertainty. These women were not merely background figures. They were architects of dynastic strategy. Wu Zetian herself, once she rose to prominence, created a bureaucracy in which women could exert influence, an extraordinary move in a deeply patriarchal society. She understood that visibility did not always equate to power. Many times, true power lay in what was unseen, unspoken, and yet deeply felt within the heart of governance. In ancient Egypt, the position of the god's wife of Ammonius emerged as one of the most powerful roles a woman could hold, especially during the later dynastic periods. While not a queen in the traditional sense, this religious title gave its holder considerable political and economic clout. The god's wife controlled temple wealth, supervised priestly duties, and in many cases, acted as a regent or guardian of royal heirs. The role was so significant that pharaohs strategically married their daughters into this position to ensure control over Theban priesthood. These women, cloaked in religious sanctity, effectively governed substantial parts of the kingdom. They became the bridges between mortal rulers and divine legitimacy. Through rituals, oracles, and temple politics, they influenced decisions far beyond what their titles suggested. The beauty of these hidden figures is found in the variety of strategies they employed. Some ruled through religion, others through diplomacy, and many through their roles as mothers and educators of future kings. In Mesopotamia, for instance, queens would often serve as high priestesses in addition to their royal duties. These dual roles gave them both spiritual and temporal authority. They participated in rituals that were believed to ensure the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. Their presence was necessary not just symbolically, but functionally. Without them, the divine structure of the empire would collapse. Beyond the structured thrones and temples of the ancient world, there were also matrilineal societies where women's authority was recognized more overtly. In some African and Southeast Asian kingdoms, royal descent was traced through the female line. While the kings ruled publicly, their queens and queen mothers often selected successors, managed court politics, and safeguarded sacred traditions. They maintained oral histories and upheld the social contracts that bound the community together. In such societies, the notion of power was not always about visibility, but about continuity. The queens were the keepers of legacy, the guarantors of memory. The roles of these women were not limited to governance and religion. They were also patrons of art, architecture, and scholarship. Hatshepsut, one of the few women to officially rule Egypt as pharaoh, left behind monuments and temples that rival those of her male counterparts. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece of ancient architecture. But Hatshepsut's reign was more than a collection of statues and columns. She rebranded her narrative to fit into the traditional expectations of kingship, portraying herself in male iconography while advancing trade, initiating building projects, and securing peace. She understood the importance of narrative control and used it to assert her legitimacy. Narrative control was a tactic many women used to great effect. Since the recording of history has often been male-dominated, these queens and influential women had to craft their image carefully. Their legacies were at risk of being erased, minimized, or misunderstood. Some embraced masculine imagery, others leaned into religious titles, and some disappeared from view entirely, working through male relatives or trusted officials. Yet even when their names were not preserved, the effects of their actions reverberated for generations. Diplomatic treaties, religious reforms, and dynastic successions bear the imprint of their hands. In the Indian subcontinent, queens and royal women also played pivotal roles, particularly in the preservation and promotion of culture. Queen Dida of Kashmir, who ruled in the 10th century of the Common Era, managed to maintain her authority in a male-dominated court and warded off invasions and rebellions. She ruled in her own right, without a male guardian, something almost unheard of in her time. Similarly, in the southern kingdoms of India, royal women were often patrons of temples and the arts, commissioning sculptures, manuscripts, and music that preserved their cultural identities. In East Asia, behind the Confucian emphasis on filial piety and patriarchal hierarchy, powerful empresses and consorts operated with quiet authority. In Korea's Goryeo and Joseon dynasties, the role of queen dowagers was critical. They influenced the appointments of officials, managed succession crises, and preserved court harmony. These women often acted as regents for underage kings and held advisory positions long after their sons took the throne. Power in these cases was layered and subtle. It was less about ruling in name and more about wielding influence through relationships, rituals, and memory. This form of power, while often invisible to traditional historical analysis, is no less real. It shaped how societies remembered their past and envisioned their future. It guided the spiritual and ethical framework of entire civilizations. Even in societies where women were explicitly barred from political office, they found other ways to leave their mark. In the Islamic caliphates, royal women like Zubaydah bint Jafar, wife of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, initiated large-scale public works projects, including improvements to the pilgrimage route to Mecca. She wielded influence over the court and was respected for her charitable deeds and public service. In the Ottoman Empire, the period known as the Sultanate of Women saw powerful women like Kosum Sultan and Hurrem Sultan act as kingmakers, guiding imperial policy through their sons and grandsons. These stories challenge the narrow assumptions of power. They ask us to look again at what it means to lead, to govern, and to influence. Power is not always a matter of public proclamation or military conquest. Sometimes, it is the patient threading of alliances, the whispered counsel in royal chambers, or the careful preservation of cultural memory. The resilience of these women lies in their adaptability. They navigated patriarchal systems not by confronting them directly, but by finding the gaps within them. They inserted themselves into religious offices, familial networks, and court rituals, weaving themselves into the fabric of power in ways that could not easily be undone. In doing so, they ensured that their influence would endure, even if their names did not. They also modeled a different kind of leadership, one that valued continuity over conquest, counsel over command, and relationship over rivalry. Their legacies are not always measured in battles won or territories gained, but in dynasties preserved, cultures enriched, and ideas sustained. Their work was often about nurturing, of people, of traditions, of futures. Understanding the history of these women also reframes how we see our present. It challenges the myth that leadership and influence are inherently masculine pursuits. It reveals a longer, richer, and more inclusive tradition of governance. It reminds us that behind every throne, there were voices that guided, supported, and often corrected the course of history. What becomes clear is that the notion of hidden queens is not a sign of their weakness, but a reflection of how history has been told. When we dig beneath the surface of traditional narratives, we uncover a network of women who were anything but passive. They were strategic thinkers, spiritual leaders, political negotiators, and cultural patrons. They were not exceptions to the rule, but part of an alternate tradition of power. In every civilization, from the stone temples of Egypt to the walled palaces of China, from the mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, women were present, shaping, guiding, and holding together the threads of empire. Their power might have worn a veil, spoken in a soft voice, or been couched in religious ceremony, but it was power nonetheless. It was the kind of power that could outlast kingdoms and outshine monuments. To remember them is not just an act of historical correction. It is a recognition of a deeper truth, that no civilization was built by men alone. Every empire, no matter how great, stood upon foundations both seen and unseen. And many of those unseen stones were laid by women whose names deserve to be spoken and whose stories deserve to be known. Their legacy is not just in what they built, but in how they endured. They remind us that true strength is often quiet, deeply rooted, and utterly transformative. Across millennia, history has focused its gaze upon monarchs, usually male, who wore the crowns and led their empires through war, expansion, and glory. Yet often, the person making decisions, issuing orders, and sustaining the realm was not the one sitting in the spotlight. From ancient Nile to imperial China, from the early foundations of Rome to the sweeping grandeur of the Han dynasty, there has existed a consistent thread of women who governed from the shadows or during crucial interludes. They were the power behind the throne, queens who ruled as regents, advisors, or peacemakers, often stepping in when kings were too young, too weak, or entirely absent. Their authority, though sometimes temporary or unofficial, had lasting consequences. They ensured dynasties endured, forged alliances that prevented bloodshed, and shaped the cultural and architectural landscapes of their realms. In the complex corridors of power, regency was often the channel through which royal women entered governance. In many cases, when a king died prematurely or left a minor heir, queens stepped in as regents to preserve stability. These periods of regency were rarely passive or ceremonial. They were times of assertive rule, calculated diplomacy, and institutional reforms. Hatshepsut of ancient Egypt is a prime example. Initially serving as regent for her stepson Thutmose III, she gradually assumed more and more authority until she took on the full regalia and titles of pharaoh. Her reign is one of the most prosperous and peaceful periods in Egyptian history, marked by architectural brilliance, trade expansion, and religious innovation. Though her ascent was unconventional, her leadership demonstrated a mastery of both governance and public image. She had obelisks erected, temples expanded, and trade missions launched, all bearing her name, yet often cloaked in language that underscored continuity rather than revolution. In China, Empress Lu of the early Han dynasty exemplified the same formidable presence. Upon the death of her husband, Emperor Gaozu, Lu acted as regent for her young son, but her influence extended well beyond his reign. She placed members of her own Lu clan into positions of power, managed internal court politics with ruthless precision, and maintained stability in a newly founded dynasty still vulnerable to fragmentation. Empress Lu's control was so pervasive that it inspired later Confucian historians to view her with suspicion, painting her as overly ambitious. Yet it was precisely this ambition that prevented the Han from crumbling in its infancy. Her political maneuvers, though controversial, kept the central administration intact and ensured a smooth continuation of dynastic rule. These regencies reveal that queens were not merely placeholders, but were often the most politically astute members of the royal family. Their leadership was a balancing act, exerting control while appearing to preserve the legitimacy of the future male monarch. But many did not fade into obscurity once their sons came of age. Instead, they remained influential as queen mothers or dowagers, wielding moral authority and unofficial influence through their familial position and networks. Beyond regency, many queens extended their power through diplomacy, especially in the form of marriage alliances. These unions were not simply romantic or ceremonial, they were geopolitical tools. Queens arranged, approved, or participated in diplomatic marriages to secure peace, expand influence, or gain access to trade networks. These acts of diplomacy required nuanced understanding of both domestic politics and foreign courts. Nefertari, the great royal wife of Pharaoh Ramses II, is a striking example. Her role was not limited to symbolic appearances or courtly elegance. She played a crucial part in cementing peace between Egypt and the Hittite Empire after years of conflict. Letters from the period suggest that her correspondence with the Hittite royal women helped build trust and understanding between the two civilizations. The peace treaty, one of the oldest surviving international agreements, bears witness to a time when women facilitated one of the earliest known diplomatic resolutions to war. Such diplomatic interventions by queens were often subtle but deeply consequential. They used gift exchanges, sacred pledges, and familial bonds to reinforce trust between rival kingdoms. In the ancient Near East, royal women were often sent across borders to marry into enemy courts, becoming cultural ambassadors and informal negotiators. These queens navigated dual loyalties with skill, ensuring that their home kingdoms remained in favorable positions while they adapted to the politics of their new environments. Their very presence in foreign courts was a symbol of peace and alliance. Even in situations where marriage alliances were arranged without direct female input, queens often oversaw their outcomes and managed the ongoing relationships. They would host visiting dignitaries, maintain correspondence with foreign queens, and promote mutual cultural understanding. In many cases, they served as intermediaries between their husbands or sons and foreign powers, lending a softer but no less effective voice to diplomacy. Cultural influence was another potent domain for queens, and one of the least overtly recognized by traditional historical narratives. Through building projects, sponsorship of religious rites, and promotion of artistic or philosophical movements, queens helped mold the cultural identity of their realms. Their patronage was often behind some of the most enduring achievements of their societies. In Rome's early history, before the Republic took shape, queens are believed to have sponsored the construction of early temples and religious institutions. Though male rulers received credit in official inscriptions, the funds, the vision, and the logistical coordination frequently came from the hands of royal women. These temples were not merely places of worship. They were symbols of political legitimacy and cultural continuity. By investing in them, queens reinforced the divine sanction of their family's rule. Queens also left their mark in city planning and infrastructure. While their roles in these areas were seldom recorded, archaeological evidence and later traditions suggest their involvement in design decisions and funding. In some cases, cities themselves were named to honor royal women or were reshaped under their guidance. Their choices about where to build temples, how to fund aqueducts, or which roads to pave had long-term implications for trade, governance, and population movement. They used architecture and urban development to communicate ideals of harmony, stability, and power. Cultural reform was another area where queens exercised influence. In societies where religion and politics were closely intertwined, queens often spearheaded or supported shifts in spiritual practice. Their personal devotions could translate into national policy. Hatshepsut's devotion to Ammonius, for instance, led to a renaissance in the god's worship and a corresponding expansion of temple wealth and influence. She commissioned artistic styles that emphasized divine order and royal femininity, altering how the pharaoh's role was depicted. The result was a legacy of both spiritual renewal and political innovation. In Mesopotamia, queens often held titles that merged royal authority with religious duties, allowing them to influence both governance and belief. Their patronage of certain deities could shift the religious center of gravity in a kingdom, affecting where temples were built and how rituals were performed. These actions were not just spiritual, they were strategic. Control over religious narrative meant control over legitimacy, and queens understood this better than most. Even when they did not rule directly or serve as regents, queens were deeply embedded in the ideological structure of monarchy. They were often seen as the moral center of the court, embodying ideals of fertility, stability, and continuity. Their presence reassured the populace that the royal family was intact and divinely favored. In this symbolic role, they still held immense sway. Their participation in festivals, ceremonies, and succession rituals was critical. When queens fell out of favor or were removed, it often signaled a period of instability or crisis. At times, queens operated behind the scenes through intricate networks of advisors, courtiers, and allies. They cultivated loyalty not through brute force, but through patronage, marriage ties, and emotional bonds. Their influence was durable because it was personal. Where kings might rule through law or conquest, queens ruled through memory, gratitude, and continuity. They sustained narratives of unity and righteousness that outlasted the reigns of many male rulers. One must also consider the way queens influenced education and royal succession. As mothers and educators of future rulers, they shaped the philosophies, policies, and temperaments of kings long before those kings took power. They passed on oral histories, ethical frameworks, and political instincts. They taught language, religion, and diplomacy. The way they were remembered by their sons often defined how future policies were framed. A queen who instilled discipline and vision might inspire a ruler to expand an empire. One who taught caution and compromise might guide a king toward peace. In many cultures, queen mothers had an almost sacred role. In the Ashanti and Yoruba kingdoms of West Africa, queen mothers were not subordinate to kings but co-rulers with their own spheres of influence. Their counsel was indispensable, and their approval was required for major decisions. Similar dynamics appeared in Southeast Asia, where matrilineal succession made royal women the anchors of dynastic continuity. Though these systems differed from those in Europe or the Middle East, they reveal that queenship could be both authoritative and enduring. The complexity of queens' roles throughout history challenges the notion that power must be loud or visible to be effective. Many queens did not need titles or crowns to lead. They used the tools available to them, marriage, motherhood, religion, architecture, diplomacy, to shape the direction of empires. Their actions often determined the difference between collapse and continuity, war and peace, chaos and order. Their contributions also challenge modern assumptions about gender and leadership. These queens did not simply reflect their cultures, they reshaped them. They stepped into leadership not out of ambition alone, but because the circumstances demanded it, and because they were uniquely equipped to meet those demands. Their success lay in their ability to be flexible, to adapt, and to thrive within systems that were often designed to exclude them. When one surveys the annals of history with fresh eyes, the image that emerges is not just of kings and conquests, but of the foundational presence of queens. They were the hands steadying the crown, the voices behind the decrees, the minds planning the future. In their absence, many kingdoms would have faltered. Their presence ensured continuity, innovation, and often, unexpectedly, progress. To fully grasp the history of any empire, one must look not only at those who sat upon the throne, but also at those who stood beside it, or slightly behind it, steering events with grace, strength, and unwavering resolve. The power behind the throne was not an illusion. It was real, necessary, and transformational. And its legacy continues to inform how we think about leadership, influence, and the often overlooked engines of history. In the long chronicle of human civilization, marked by the rise and fall of empires, the thunder of war horses, and the clash of iron on the battlefield, the image most often conjured is that of a male warrior king charging forward to defend his realm. Yet, just outside the spotlight of conventional historical narrative stands a multitude of queens whose courage, intellect, and strategic vision turned tides during moments of deep national crisis. Though some never held a sword, and others fought more with words than weapons, they proved themselves indispensable during periods of war, invasion, and political instability. They did not simply survive chaos, they shaped its outcome. These women, often left unnamed or buried beneath layers of myth and misinterpretation, represent the hidden dimension of leadership in times of conflict. Consider Semiramis of Assyria, a figure who straddles the boundary between history and legend. While the full extent of her existence is debated, the persistence of her image across cultures tells us something critical about how ancient people understood female power in wartime. She is depicted not only as a ruler, but as a builder, a conqueror, and a lawgiver. The stories of her leading armies, governing vast territories, and commissioning architectural marvels reflect a deep cultural recognition of her capability. Whether Semiramis herself directly commanded troops or not matters less than the fact that she was remembered as someone who could. Her legend shaped the expectation that a queen could be more than a ceremonial figure, that she could also be a commander in times of need. Actual queens throughout history may not have charged into battle clad in armor, but many played decisive roles in determining the outcome of wars and rebellions. Their contributions came through strategy, persuasion, and the ability to hold fragile coalitions together. They used intelligence networks to outmaneuver rivals, offered tactical advice to generals, and made personal sacrifices to preserve national unity. In certain cases, they even inspired revolts or resistance movements by the sheer force of their resolve. During times of foreign threat or civil unrest, queens were often at the center of efforts to maintain control. Their actions did not always make it into the annals of mainstream history, but they were recorded in letters, rumors, and the cautious observations of scribes. There are mentions of queen mothers in the Roman world who advised emperors to reconsider campaigns that ultimately ended in disaster. These women, while unnamed in the formal record, clearly exerted influence behind the scenes. Their advice, strategic in nature, was often born from a deeper understanding of diplomacy and regional politics than the brash ambitions of military commanders allowed. These unnamed advisors likely worked to preserve lives and resources in empires stretched too thin by conquest. Their role was not just reactive, it was proactive. They anticipated danger and acted swiftly. In many kingdoms, especially during succession crises or regencies, queens and queen mothers became the de facto rulers. They held together fragile governments through a combination of political maneuvering, forging temporary alliances, and even deceiving rival factions when necessary. These were not the gentle arts of passive caretakers, but the difficult calculations of wartime leaders. They chose the lesser of evils, negotiated terms that averted destruction, and often bore the brunt of political backlash in silence. In regions plagued by frequent invasions, such as the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, queens often became the last bastion of national dignity. While their husbands or sons marched off to war, they managed the homeland. When enemy forces breached the walls, it was sometimes queens who negotiated peace, led resistance, or ensured the survival of dynastic heirs by smuggling them to safety. These stories of escape, disguise, and last-minute defiance often survive only in folklore or scattered inscriptions, but their consistency across cultures suggests a pattern of female resilience during moments of acute crisis. The sacrifices they made in these roles were immense. They endured political isolation, imprisonment, or public scorn. Some were exiled after failed negotiations. Others were forced into marriages that secured temporary peace. Still others died in obscurity, their legacies buried because their actions defied traditional norms of female behavior. Yet without them, many realms would have succumbed to internal strife or external conquest. In ancient China, the role of empress dowagers during political upheaval was crucial. Often stepping in when emperors were weak, underage, or embroiled in court factionalism, these women wielded extraordinary authority. Their palaces became political headquarters, their edicts as influential as those of emperors. Empress Dowager Cixi of a later period, though controversial, is a testament to how a woman could dominate an empire's politics in times of decline. Her story echoes those of earlier women whose political cunning shaped the fate of dynasties. In medieval Europe, queens consort and regents faced similar trials. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, not only accompanied her husband on crusade, but also led military campaigns in defense of her own territories. She coordinated with allies, secured funding, and negotiated terms with rival nobles. Her leadership was as decisive in political corridors as it was in open warfare. Though she is better known than most queens of her time, many others walked parallel paths without similar recognition. In Eastern Africa, women like Queen Amina of Zaza left indelible marks through warfare and governance. Known for expanding her kingdom's territory and reinforcing its military strength, Amina is remembered as a ruler who defied conventional expectations. Her campaigns reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the region. Though later generations often cloaked her in myth, the foundation of her story is one of strategic mastery and fearless leadership during periods of expansion and resistance. The tactic of using espionage, covert alliances, and psychological warfare was another tool employed by queens in times of national threat. These were not mere side notes to male-driven war efforts, but were essential elements of strategy. Queens maintained networks of informants across enemy lines, sent coded messages, and sometimes exploited religious or cultural symbols to rally public support. Their efforts were multi-layered. They needed to outwit rivals within their own courts while simultaneously fending off foreign threats. Their knowledge of court politics, combined with their proximity to power, made them uniquely capable of managing such complexity. Where kings might be engaged on the battlefield, queens controlled the domestic front, handling food distribution, managing fear among the populace, and keeping the machinery of government running. These tasks, though often dismissed as administrative, were the glue that held nations together under pressure. Without them, military victories would have been meaningless. In the context of prolonged sieges or occupations, queens often served as symbols of hope and resistance. Their calm demeanor in public appearances, their steadfast participation in ceremonies, and their refusal to abandon cities under threat inspired loyalty and morale. There are records from Byzantium and Persia of queens refusing to flee even when their cities were under imminent attack, choosing instead to stay among their people. This act alone could prevent panic and maintain public order. When peace returned, their work was not finished. Post-conflict reconstruction often fell within their influence. They oversaw the rebuilding of temples, homes, and schools, helping to restore a sense of normalcy. They encouraged artists, teachers, and spiritual leaders to resume their work, signaling a return to stability. In doing so, they helped their societies heal from the trauma of war. Some even spearheaded legal or societal reforms designed to prevent similar crises in the future, setting new standards for governance and accountability. This resilience was not limited to prominent courts or wealthy kingdoms. In tribal confederations, desert emirates, and mountainous communities, women often stepped into leadership roles when male chieftains were killed or displaced. Oral traditions across cultures, from the steppes of Mongolia to the jungles of Central America, tell of women who defended their people through sheer determination, guided them through migration, or rebuilt after devastation. Their leadership was often holistic, combining governance with care, tradition with adaptation. Part of what makes their contributions so extraordinary is the duality they had to embody. In times of peace, they were expected to be symbols of grace, fertility, and virtue. But in times of conflict, they were expected to command, to negotiate, and at times to deceive. The ability to shift between these roles required not just intelligence, but profound emotional strength. They often bore the burden of public expectation and private grief in equal measure. While their names may not have survived the centuries with the same clarity as those of male generals or kings, their impact is deeply etched in the history of survival. They were the ones who stood firm when cities burned, when councils turned on one another, and when all hope seemed lost. In their steadiness, entire cultures found the will to resist, to rebuild, and to continue. One of the reasons these stories remain underrepresented is that traditional historical documentation has favored the acts of war over the acts of resilience, the visible over the strategic, the loud over the quiet. Yet it is precisely in the quiet corners of history where some of the greatest acts of courage have occurred. A whispered piece of intelligence that saves an army, a nighttime escape that preserves a royal line, a bold refusal to capitulate that inspires generations. These are not footnotes. These are defining moments of leadership. As more archives are studied, and as archaeologists uncover new inscriptions and artifacts, more of these women's stories are being reconstructed. And even where names are still missing, the patterns they left behind, of cunning, endurance, and self-sacrifice, speak volumes. Their lives remind us that leadership in times of crisis comes in many forms. It is not always a matter of commanding troops or signing treaties. Sometimes it is the act of holding a kingdom together while the world around it falls apart. These queens, known and unknown, were often called upon to make decisions with no clear right answer. They had to choose between family loyalty and national survival, between immediate peace and long-term stability. They endured personal loss and public criticism. And yet they chose to lead. Not because they sought power, but because the alternative abandonment of their people was unthinkable. Their stories remind us that history is not only the record of conquest and construction, but also of endurance, adaptation, and care. Queens in conflict and crisis did more than defend kingdoms. They defended the very possibility of civilization. They remind us that leadership requires not just strength, but also clarity, empathy, and unwavering resolve. And in remembering them, we reclaim a fuller picture of what it means to lead when everything is at risk. Throughout the long arc of human civilization, stone has preserved the names and deeds of rulers, generals, and conquerors. Obelisks, steles, tablets, and temples stand as physical testaments to the power and influence of those who shaped the ancient world. Yet while the chisels of history have prominently recorded the triumphs of kings and emperors, the legacies of many queens, women whose leadership, vision, and choices indelibly altered their societies, have often remained in the shadows. Their contributions, though less frequently celebrated in bold inscriptions or bronze statues, are no less enduring. From the laws they influenced to the spiritual beliefs they cultivated, from the art and knowledge they fostered to the trade networks they helped establish, these queens carved their impact not just in stone, but in the living fabric of the civilizations they helped define. One of the most significant ways queens left their mark was through religious innovation and spiritual patronage. In ancient Egypt, religion was the bedrock of political power. While male pharaohs are often remembered for their association with gods like Ra or Osiris, queens also played key roles in shaping and supporting cults, rituals, and spiritual institutions. Some queens were worshipped in their own right, while others acted as high priestesses or patrons of specific deities. One such figure, whose name has faded from public memory, may have had a central role in elevating a now-lost local deity to regional prominence. This queen, while overshadowed by the pharaoh she supported, directed temple construction, organized festivals, and funded priestly schools. Her efforts not only spread the deity's influence, but also unified various communities under a shared spiritual banner. In doing so, she helped stabilize a kingdom and reinforce its cultural identity. Spiritual legacy was a powerful tool for cohesion and continuity. By shaping religious practice, queens could mold public values, communal rights, and the emotional center of the state. These contributions were often cloaked in piety, but were, in fact, deeply political. They reinforced dynastic legitimacy, soothed internal divisions, and aligned the people with the ruling class's ideology. This was not mere devotion, but a deliberate and far-reaching form of leadership. In Mesopotamia, queens in city-states such as Lagash or Mari influenced legal systems in ways that have only recently begun to be understood. Though kings were the ones who issued edicts and codified laws, queens played vital roles behind the scenes. Some acted as mediators during legal disputes, particularly in matters involving inheritance, marriage, or temple property. Others were known to convene councils of elders or advise judges. There is growing evidence from clay tablets that a queen in one Mesopotamian city promoted legal reforms that improved the status of women, especially in property ownership and the ability to initiate divorce. Though her name may not appear in monumental inscriptions, her fingerprints are visible in the shifts that occurred during her lifetime. The fact that she worked through the existing system rather than against it shows the sophistication of her approach and the lasting change it enabled. The influence of queens extended well beyond law and religion. They were often key patrons of the arts, sciences, and infrastructure. In many ancient and medieval courts, it was the queen who directed the commissioning of murals, music, sculpture, and textiles. Her tastes shaped the aesthetic language of the court, while her support provided employment to artists and craftsmen. Some queens sponsored astronomical research, collected manuscripts, and established early forms of libraries. The wives of emperors, especially in regions like Persia, India, and Byzantium, often funded intellectual endeavors that preserved cultural heritage for generations to come. These investments in knowledge and art were not accidental. Queens understood that culture was a soft power capable of outlasting political regimes. In supporting temples, schools, and artisan guilds, they helped codify traditions and styles that later generations would regard as the gold standard. The very symbols we now associate with classical or golden ages of certain civilizations, be it specific dress, architectural forms, or ceremonial music, were often cultivated under the patronage of queens whose names may no longer be familiar. Trade was another domain where queens exerted lasting influence. Though military campaigns typically took the limelight, economic stability was often secured through subtler means. Queens managed palace economies, supervised taxation related to temple estates, and sometimes even negotiated trade terms with foreign merchants. In the African Sahel, the queens of certain city-states were known to control caravans and ensure the safe movement of goods across vast and dangerous terrain. In Asia, queens consort of maritime empires like those in Southeast Asia played critical roles in encouraging commerce between Indian, Arab, and Chinese traders. They understood that wealth was not only about gold and silver, it was about relationships, logistics, and trust. Their ability to facilitate these connections often determined whether a kingdom flourished or faded. By maintaining peace through strategic marriage alliances or local diplomacy, queens helped keep trade routes open. These choices had cascading effects. The revenue generated supported temples, funded military defense, and built granaries and water systems. Thus, decisions made in royal quarters about who to trust, which ports to develop, and which roads to repair had ripple effects that reached the poorest farmer and the most distant merchant. Their legacy is embedded in the prosperity of cities, the stability of dynasties, and the exchange of ideas across continents. Despite all this, the historical record has systematically underrepresented these contributions. The reasons are numerous and complex. Ancient chroniclers, often men embedded in military or religious institutions, prioritized what they saw as the most significant events: conquests, battles, the founding of cities, the deaths of kings. Because queens seldom fit neatly into these categories, their stories were often omitted or condensed. Even when they played central roles, their actions were sometimes credited to male relatives. In other cases, their influence was described in terms that diminished their agency, portraying them as manipulative, meddling, or merely lucky. Cultural norms also contributed to the erasure. In many societies, it was considered unseemly or inappropriate to highlight women's authority, especially in political or religious spheres. As a result, scribes and historians downplayed or omitted queens' involvement in decisions, treaties, or reforms. Even when queens were honored with tombs or shrines, later dynasties sometimes defaced or destroyed these monuments to rewrite the narrative of the past. As regimes changed, so too did the willingness to remember powerful women. Furthermore, some queens actively chose invisibility as a strategy. Knowing the dangers of political envy or the fragility of their position, they deliberately worked behind the scenes. Their names may not be engraved in stone, but the policies they championed, the artists they protected, and the traditions they initiated continued to shape their societies long after they were gone. Their invisibility was not a sign of irrelevance. It was often a form of survival, a means of sustaining influence without drawing the lethal attention of rivals. In some cultures, women's contributions were preserved through oral traditions rather than written ones. Songs, folktales, and rituals remembered the generosity of a queen who fed the hungry during famine, the courage of a mother who protected her son from assassins, or the wisdom of a dowager who resolved a dynastic crisis. These stories, though not inscribed on stone or preserved in papyrus, were handed down across generations. Only now, as scholars re-examine the past through feminist and post-colonial lenses, are these traditions being recognized for what they are: archives of alternative history. There is an irony in how the very mechanisms that preserved male glory, inscriptions, temple dedications, royal edicts, often excluded women's stories, yet it is in the everyday textures of society that queens most effectively shaped civilization. The food people ate, the gods they worshipped, the festivals they observed, the legal protections they received, and the songs they sang often bore the imprint of a queen's influence. Even if their names were not spoken aloud, their decisions echoed in the rhythm of daily life. The legacy of these queens also lives on in the challenges they issued to power structures. Some pushed against rigid gender norms, adopting male symbols and titles to secure authority. Others redefined power itself, not as domination, but as stewardship, relationship, and continuity. They demonstrated that leadership could coexist with compassion, that governance could include listening and mediation, and that strength was not always marked by violence. Their lives offer a broader and more inclusive understanding of legacy. A queen's worth was not measured solely by conquest or monuments, but by the communities she held together, the values she upheld, and the future she helped prepare. Her impact might not shine as brightly in a battlefield report, but it burned steadily in the long, quiet work of nation-building. As historians and archaeologists uncover more evidence, through reinterpreted texts, unearthed relics, and forgotten folklore, the map of historical influence expands. The silent architects of civilization are beginning to be heard. Their contributions, once overshadowed, are now illuminated not just for their uniqueness, but for their foundational role in shaping human development. The queens whose names were once hidden behind thrones, palaces, or temple walls are being restored to their rightful place in the story of humanity. Not as accessories to kings, not as passive figures of beauty or tragedy, but as active participants in the grand project of civilization. Their legacies, etched in temple walls, whispered in songs, or embodied in customs, remain vital parts of who we are and what we value. By acknowledging their influence, we do not merely revise history, we enrich it. We expand our understanding of leadership, wisdom, and resilience. We begin to see that the shaping of the world was never the work of one gender or one class alone, but the collective achievement of many hands, many minds, and many hearts. And in doing so, we carve a more honest and complete portrait of the past, one in which queens are no longer hidden, but honored for the stones they laid in the foundation of our shared human legacy. In the ever-evolving tapestry of human history, the threads of memory are often woven by those who hold power. The scribes, the chroniclers, the court historians, and later the scholars who carried forward what was preserved and deemed worthy of remembrance. For centuries, that process of preservation has largely favored the deeds of kings, emperors, generals, and patriarchs. The achievements of women, particularly queens, high priestesses, female regents, and tribal matriarchs, have often been pushed to the margins or erased entirely. This marginalization was not accidental. It reflected the values of patriarchal societies that prioritized male action and leadership as the primary shapers of history, relegating women's influence to the private sphere, the symbolic, or the domestic. But history, when revisited with open eyes and more inclusive frameworks, tells a different story. It reveals a world where women were not simply passive observers of history, but active participants and powerful agents of change. It is time to reclaim their narrative, not as a gesture of token acknowledgement, but as a long-overdue correction to how we understand the past. One of the earliest regions to demonstrate the prominence of women in power is Sumer, where some of the most ancient cities in human history emerged. Long before many later empires were formed, the wives of early Sumerian kings wielded vast religious and economic authority. These women, often holding the dual roles of consort and priestess, were deeply embedded in the governance of temples and landholdings. The temple complex was not just a place of worship. It was the center of the city's economy, education, and social life. Queens supervised its activities, managed agricultural estates, organized labor forces, and mediated disputes. Their wealth and influence were comparable to that of their royal husbands. In some inscriptions, their names appear alongside kings, not beneath them. They commissioned religious hymns, advised on legal matters, and in some cases, even ruled in their own right during periods of succession crisis or dynastic instability. Yet later historians would often gloss over these early queens, framing them as ceremonial figures rather than leaders. This reductionist view does a disservice not only to their memory, but also to our understanding of how early civilizations functioned. The reality is that these women helped shape the structure of cities, the rituals of worship, and the very rhythms of everyday life. Their absence from dominant narratives has less to do with lack of contribution and more to do with the discomfort patriarchal structures have long had with powerful women. This pattern of marginalization is not unique to the ancient Near East. Across the globe, women have held significant leadership roles, particularly in societies that resisted rigid gender hierarchies. In pre-colonial Africa, for example, female tribal leaders and queen mothers played central roles in governance, diplomacy, and social cohesion. In the Ashanti Kingdom, the queen mother was not merely a symbolic presence, but a powerful political figure who advised the king and had the authority to nominate or depose him. Her voice carried great weight in military and civil decisions, and she often served as the moral conscience of the state. In other regions, such as among the Yoruba or the Igbo, women held positions as market regulators, spiritual mediums, and village heads. They organized trade networks, upheld customary law, and mediated disputes. Their leadership was not anomalous. It was embedded in the cultural and political systems of their societies. These contributions, however, were severely disrupted by colonialism, which imposed European systems of patriarchy and governance that deliberately undermined female authority. Colonial administrators often refused to recognize women as legitimate political actors, redirecting power exclusively to male chiefs or elders. The result was a historical amnesia imposed by foreign rule, which redefined power in strictly masculine terms and devalued the leadership of women who had sustained communities for generations. The erasure of these women from the historical record is thus not only a distortion of the past, but a reflection of the colonial biases that continue to shape how history is taught and understood. In the Andes of South America, women in ancient societies such as the Moche, Wari, and Inca held considerable influence. Archaeological findings, particularly richly adorned female burials, suggest that women held spiritual, political, and economic authority. The Lady of Chao, whose remains were found in northern Peru, was buried with elaborate regalia typically reserved for male rulers. Her tattoos, headdress, and ceremonial artifacts indicate her role was far beyond that of a simple noblewoman. She may have been a warrior, a priestess, or a governor. The discovery challenged assumptions that leadership in ancient South American societies was exclusively male. Oral traditions, too, speak of powerful women who governed valleys, led rituals, and organized labor for massive construction projects. Their stories, often dismissed as myth or metaphor, are now being reevaluated as legitimate sources of historical knowledge. Bringing these stories into the light requires more than just uncovering forgotten names. It demands a fundamental shift in how history is approached. It means recognizing that the criteria for historical significance have been biased towards certain forms of power: military conquest, territorial expansion, and monumental architecture. These are domains where men were more visibly active, particularly in patriarchal cultures. But when we broaden our understanding of leadership to include diplomacy, economic stewardship, religious guidance, and cultural patronage, the presence of women becomes not exceptional, but integral. It also means listening to diverse voices and sources. Too much of historical scholarship has relied on elite, literate, and often male perspectives. To reclaim the stories of powerful women, we must turn to oral traditions, local histories, folk songs, and community memory. These forms of knowledge, long dismissed by academic institutions, often preserve details that formal texts omit. They offer nuanced portrayals of women as wise judges, fierce warriors, compassionate healers, and strategic diplomats. They challenge the notion that leadership must conform to a single model and invite us to consider alternative forms of influence. This reclamation is not merely academic. It has profound implications for how societies understand gender, power, and identity today. When young people see that women have always led, that queens, priestesses, and matriarchs were not rare exceptions but vital actors in human history, it expands the realm of what is possible. It creates space for broader participation in public life and affirms that leadership is not defined by gender, but by vision, courage, and commitment. Reclaiming these narratives also means acknowledging the structural forces that have kept them hidden. For too long, textbooks, museums, and classrooms have focused on the deeds of great men while reducing women to footnotes or romantic subplots. Correcting this imbalance requires intentional effort. It involves rewriting curricula, supporting inclusive research, and challenging the myths that continue to shape collective memory. It also means confronting uncomfortable truths about how power is recorded and remembered, truths that expose the limitations of the sources on which traditional history relies. At the same time, this work is not about erasing male figures or vilifying past traditions. It is about expanding the historical lens to include the full range of human experience. It is about recognizing that the past was never a stage set only for men, but a shared space of struggle, innovation, and transformation in which women played indispensable roles. From the temple courtyards of Sumer to the rainforests of Africa, from the highlands of Peru to the palace libraries of Byzantium, women have been there, ruling, advising, healing, building, and enduring. There is a quiet power in this realization. It transforms how we view not only the past, but also the present. It invites a reimagining of legacy, not as a linear tale of kings and wars, but as a complex, interwoven story of families, communities, and ideas shaped by both women and men. It encourages respect for the subtle forms of influence that have often been overlooked and calls us to honor the labor, wisdom, and resilience that sustained civilizations. As we reclaim the narratives of these queens, priestesses, and female leaders, we do more than fill gaps in the historical record. We challenge the very structures that made those gaps possible. We declare that history belongs not to a chosen few, but to all who lived it. And in doing so, we create a more honest, inclusive, and inspiring account of who we are and how we got here. These women were never truly silent. They spoke through the laws they shaped, the children they raised, the alliances they forged, and the faiths they nurtured. They built cities, defended borders, negotiated peace, and endured betrayal. Their strength was not always shouted, but it was always present. Their stories are not new. They are simply being heard again, perhaps for the first time in their full complexity. In reclaiming their narrative, we do not offer charity or sympathy. We offer recognition. We acknowledge the truth that power has many forms and that leadership is not the preserve of any one gender. We celebrate the women who stood, often alone, against empires and expectations, and we commit ourselves to ensuring their legacy is never hidden again. And so, the journey toward a more complete history continues. It moves through the sands of ancient Sumer, the rivers of Africa, the mountains of the Andes, and into the hearts of classrooms, museums, and conversations today. These women walked before us, carved paths where none existed, and left legacies in law, belief, culture, and memory. To walk in their footsteps is not only to honor them, it is to remember that we are all part of a story still being written, where every voice matters, and every truth deserves